Okay. All right. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Carolyn Merrick. I'm program coordinator here at the center. Tonight's guest is Dr. Beverly Adams. She'll speak to us about microaggressions and why they matter. Enid Krieger is also with us. She's a center member and a very important member of our Diversity and Inclusion Committee. Enid is responsible for suggesting this speaker series in the first place and for procuring all of our wonderful speakers. So thank you, Enid, for such important, tireless work.
My pleasure.
Enid will introduce Dr. Adams after a few words from our Executive Director, Peter Thompson. If you have a question or a comment, please use the chat at any time during the presentation. Enid will monitor the chat and ask Dr. Adams your questions when her presentation is complete. Please also have a pencil and paper available for an exercise, and you'll also be asked to fill out a brief survey at the end, and thank you in advance. So thank you, and now the Center's Executive Director, Peter Thompson.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome, and thank you for joining us tonight. I am Peter Thompson. I have the great pleasure and honor of serving as the Executive Director here at the Center at Belvedere, formerly known as the Senior Center. The center's mission is to provide holistic wellness programs that research shows time and time again are the key ingredients to aging well. And our values include community impact and excellence, as well as diversity and inclusion. In line with our mission and values, we're very pleased to be offering this second Building a More Inclusive Community Local Voice and Diversity speaker series. Each night of this series is free and open to the public. And as we were saying during the warm-up, that means the public all over the world on Zoom. So please tell your friends. We encourage them to come and enjoy us and learn more about what the center is about and what diversity and inclusion can meet here in our center community and really worldwide. These programs are all free for two reasons. One, our speakers are all providing their services pro bono. So thank you, Dr. Adams, and to all our speakers for doing that. And because the center, as a nonprofit organization owned by the community to serve the community, does a lot of our programs open to all and indeed all ages. And this is an example of how we do that. The work around equity, diversity, and inclusion is going to take decades. It's taken us centuries to get to where we are in America today, and it's going to take a long time to get us to a more equitable community. The center is committed to doing the challenging and vital work that we need to do in partnership with our community, to do the intentional ongoing work to fight systemic racism here in the greater Charlottesville-Albemarle area. We are taking several actions in addition to this series. We just this afternoon, about a half an hour ago, our executive committee did authorize a new racial equity task force, and the formal proposals going to our board next week. So that group can start its work shortly thereafter. And I'll be happy to keep you folks up to date about that. You can keep in touch through our e-newsletter about that and everything that we do. So I know you're here for Dr. Adams. So without further ado, again, welcome and thank you for being here. And I'm pleased to turn it over to my very good friend and great volunteer leader here at the center, Enid Krieger. Enid?
Thank you, Peter. And thank you, Carolyn. My goodness. I have to tell you all that I am super excited because this program has well over 200 people who have registered to participate. And that tells me that everyone is enjoying it and everyone is benefiting by it. And I'm thrilled to be a part of it. I'm also thrilled to be introducing this amazing person who is not only my friend, but she is just amazing, Dr. Beverly Adams. Beverly is going to walk us through some of the ways in which each of us might be a little bit guilty of sending unconscious or sometimes unintentional messages that can make a person feel uncomfortable or even excluded, and especially when that person is a member of a traditionally disadvantaged group. Dr. Adams moved to Charlottesville with her daughter Jasmine in 1992 from Youngstown, Ohio. Until recently, she was the assistant dean at UVA's College of Arts and Sciences. She was also associate professor emeritus in the Department of Psychology. Dr. Adams holds a BA in psychology from Spelman College, both an MS in developmental psychology and a Ph.D. in cognitive psychology psycholinguistics from the University of Pittsburgh. She studied language processing as a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Massachusetts and the Netherlands Institute of Advanced Studies in the Humanities and Social Sciences. She's done tons of research on the topic of microaggression, especially as it impacts the physical and mental health of Black women who hold leadership positions. Since coming to Charlottesville, Dr. Adams has herself held several leadership positions and member positions for a number of organizations. She was a founding member and past president of the UVA Black Faculty and Staff Employee Resources Group, vice chair of the board of the Women's Initiative, president of the Charlottesville chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority, president of the Charlottesville chapter of the Links Incorporated, a board member at City of Promise, the Virginia Social Sciences Association. The list of her contributions to our community goes on and on. I know that this is a topic that we're all deeply interested in, so I will stop talking and introduce Dr. Beverly Adams.
Thank you, Enid, for that very nice introduction. When you first told me about this second year of diversity speakers at the center, I was very happy to hear that the center was not one of those agencies that was a 1 year and done nonprofit. Thank you for asking me to share my research and the topic of microaggressions. My title is, and Carolyn, you can put that on the screen now. My title is Microaggressions, Subtle Acts of Exclusion. Why do they matter? I have purposely worded it as a question, and I'll explain why as I go through the talk. Probably most of you are familiar at some level with the term microaggressions, but in fact, I want to orient you to a more useful term that provides greater clarity to the function of these kinds of statements. It may not be quite as catchy as microaggression, but I will use it throughout my presentation so that you will become more comfortable and familiar with the phrase subtle acts of exclusion. Here is a general definition of subtle acts of exclusion. Carolyn? Subtle acts of exclusion are daily, repeated verbal or behavioral indignities, intentional or unintentional. That communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative attitudes towards stigmatized or marginalized groups. I'd like you to consider the following examples. Next slide. You would be a very beautiful woman if you didn't wear that head wrap or hijab all that time. To a lesbian couple, so which one of you is the man in the relationship? A one-piece bathing suit would flatter your larger body type better than that two-piece suit. This couch is really light. Even a woman could lift it. I forgive the way that you are acting. You must be on your period. You speak white English. Didn't you grow up around Black people? Okay. Subtle acts of inclusion is a more clarifying term that addresses the harm that these kinds of statements may cause. From the perspective of my research, SAEs are typically spoken with the intention of the speaker to be complimentary and sometimes lighthearted and humorous, but in fact, they are insulting. This kind of ambiguity is intriguing, but can make the target as well as the speaker very uncomfortable in open discussion. Unfortunately, the term microaggression has been misinterpreted to equate SAEs with inconsequential importance. The faulty premise and the prefix micro produces faulty logic. It goes something like this. If the statement or phrases are micro, the thinking is that they must have a minor or trivial impact. And if the impact is insignificant or negligible, then why are we wasting valuable time and energy discussing them? When in fact, the power of these kinds of statements is correlated with the detriment of both physical and mental health. Let's address the expression subtle acts of exclusion carefully and in detail with simple definitions for each word. Subtle, not immediately obvious or comprehensible, something that is difficult to detect or analyze, but marked by requiring mental acuteness or ingenuity, something considered non-direct. acts, the actions or process of doing something typically to achieve an aim or goal. Exclusion is defined as to bar from participation, consideration, or inclusion. And I'll repeat that. To bar from participation, consideration, or inclusion. Okay. While the statements may be intended to be complimentary, SAEs in fact point out how the target is different and not a part of the speaker's group. It brings unwanted attention to the recipient. By making these kinds of statements, the speaker is singling out someone as an outsider, someone who they think unconsciously does not belong, and thus creating some level of tension that is uncomfortable for the recipient, and depending on the way that things are handled, there may be a level of tension and uncomfortableness for the speaker. The very nature of language is that it varies in its degree of ambiguity. Some of you may be surprised to hear that language is ambiguous, and others of you may be thinking, well, of course, it's ambiguous. Some folks work very hard to be as clear as possible and pride themselves on unambiguous written work and speech. So you may be thinking that there is no way that Beverly could be speaking to me because I am very clear in all that I do. However, from a psycholinguistics perspective, if you think that you are being wholly unambiguous, this is actually impossible. There is nothing about language that is straightforward. Let me explain. Generally speaking, when you are talking or even writing, you are talking with people who have a shared perspective on a shared content level as you. You are talking with people who are generally in your circle, albeit it may be a somewhat large circle. But even within your circle, there are times when you and your family members get confused with what you are saying. You must ask your teenager, for example, or your spouse, what are you talking about? To your teenager, sometimes you might say something such as, come home at a reasonable hour. Now the teenager may interpret that as sometimes before 1 a.m. You as the parent may say, well, she knows or he knows that the curfew is at 11 p.m. Truthfully, mom and dad, you see how your language is ambiguous and can be the start of some uncomfortable times. Now, for those of you who love language and often play with language, you have some sense of what I'm talking about. The ambiguity of language is how I became interested in the multiplicity of interpretation. As a young child, I was very interested in jokes and riddles, not because they made me laugh necessarily, but because they were interesting in making other people laugh. For example, I still remember a joke from the monthly children's magazine, Humpty Dumpty, when I was in elementary school that fascinated me. The riddle was something like this. What is the difference between a postage stamp and a donkey? What is the difference between a postage stamp and a donkey? The answer, one you stick with a lick and the other you lick with a stick. Now, my 10-year-old self thought that that was really entertaining, but it's really not that funny. But for me, it was the beginning of when I began to question parallelism in language and syntactic structure. In middle school and high school, I learned about metaphor, simile, irony, and other types of figurative language. Now, in undergraduate school, I majored in psychology, and that taught me how to use the scientific method of inquiry, and then on to graduate school, where I discovered psycholinguistics in cognitive psychology. Psycholinguistics is a subdivision of cognitive psychology that examines language from a psychological perspective. Here, I got the tools to examine ambiguity in language processing, specifically syntactic ambiguity, and examining the structure of language. Now, next slide. Here is a sentence that seems very simple. What I want you to do, and get your pencil for this, here's the sentence. John hit George with a rock. Who had the rock? So just write that down. Who you believe has the rock? Okay. About 75 to 80% of you will say John had the rock, and about 20 to 25% of you will say that George had the rock. There is a psycholinguistic principle that guides human language processing to make the preferred interpretation that John has the rock, and John used the rock to hit George. However, about 20% of you process this sentence with the interpretation that George had the rock. If you came up with the second interpretation, it is not wrong. Neither one is right or wrong. But the science tells us that it took you about 100 milliseconds longer to develop the interpretation that George had the rock when John hit him. Okay. This is the kind of ambiguity that I was trained on and that I studied closely. I hope I'm building my case about the ambiguity of language, and I'll give you another example. I'd like you to use your paper and pencil for this. This is when I'd like you to make a sketch. Oops, take that away, Carolyn, don't tell them yet. So the milk is in the refrigerator next to the beer. Here is a sentence. The milk is in the refrigerator next to the beer. What I'd like you to do is to sketch your representation of this sentence. So it doesn't have to be fancy. As I said before, you can use stick figures, but I want you to get a representation in front of you of where is the milk, where is the refrigerator, where is the beer. Okay, draw it quickly, just a sketch. Okay, so now you can click the slide. The majority of you made the representation such that the milk and the beer are in the refrigerator. So you drew a refrigerator or just a square, and you put the milk and the beer beside each other, maybe on the same shelf. But there is indeed a second interpretation. So click here. Imagine that the milk is in the refrigerator, but it's the refrigerator that is next to the beer. Consider a keg of beer. So some of you drew this interpretation. So again, about 75% of you put the milk and the beer inside the refrigerator, but the others of you put the refrigerator and the beer next to one another. So what I'm trying to get you to understand is that even with the same words, nothing changes from the milk is in the refrigerator next to the beer, but our interpretation changes. And I began to ask why. Why is one more preferred than the other? And I began to think about context. Maybe there is something about context that makes us prefer one versus the other. So some of you, again, might say, well, that second interpretation is so unusual, it's almost impossible. And I'll give you an example of how it is quite possible and quite reasonable. So imagine a kitchen with two refrigerators. One has nothing beside it, and a second has, say, a keg of beer beside it. And so if I tell you to go into the kitchen and get me some milk, because the milk is in the refrigerator next to the beer, going into the kitchen, you would never open the refrigerator door of the one that didn't have beer next to it. So although in some situations it may seem that this is unusual, in others it is very appropriate. So as I said, I began to think about context and how that has an influence in how we understand what we do. Let's go to the next slide. And I want you to understand this slide. After the presentation, members of the audience wrote down a few notes. What I'd like you to do with your paper and pencil is write down the definition of notes. After the presentation, members of the audience wrote down a few notes. Okay, again, simple. So this is based on an experiment that I found really exciting when I was in graduate school, because what it did was it took two groups of students. One group were music majors and the other group was non-music majors. So when they were tasked with the same thing I just asked you, read this statement and write down the definition you have for notes. Interestingly enough, the music majors by far wrote their definition as musical notes, and the non-music majors wrote their definitions as just short little phrases that help us to remember things. Again, what's interesting about this is neither group thought that notes was an ambiguous word. So again, from where we come, we can produce the kind of definition that we think is appropriate for our sake. So again, I'm thinking, does it really matter whether the rock in that first example was in George or John's hand? And is it really earth-shaking whether the milk was in the refrigerator next to the beer and the beer was outside the refrigerator? In academia, it is important. It's the kind of thing that I study. But once you start thinking about outside of the ivory tower, we begin to think about how the real world will have impact on how we see it. Okay, a little background. Chester Pierce, an African-American, Harvard-educated and trained psychiatrist, is credited with the first use of the term microaggression. In the literature in the late 1960s and early 1970s, he wrote to describe the expressions of despair and confusion reported by his African-American clients as they discussed their psychological stressors and concerns. At Harvard and in academic circles, the term microaggression was included in much discussion back in the late 1960s and 70s, but stayed primarily within academia and within the academic community. The term implicit bias became very prevalent in the popular press in the last few years when Hillary Clinton was running for president, and we heard about this term implicit bias. But for psychology, this is a term that had long been studied and explored, especially in the areas of cognitive psychology, and social cognition. But it gets headlines in the popular press when it includes race, ethnicity, gender, and sexuality. I think that that is a good thing, in fact, that those topics in the real world get studied by university professors and researchers and vice versa. Implicit bias is now examined by psychologists, sociologists, social workers, physicians, ministers, and on and on. Now, it is always interesting to me that when I talk to an audience of members of marginalized groups, women, religious groups, LGBTQ, and non-white groups, they tell me that they understand exactly what I'm talking about and offer lots of examples. But when I talk to predominantly white groups, white males have told me that subtle acts of exclusion do not really exist. But if they admit that they do exist for some people, they say that nobody is really being hurt or excluded by these minimalistic expressions. They become uncomfortable and defensive, saying that this is all about being politically correct and nobody that they know seems bothered by these kinds of expressions. They might further add, I've been saying these kinds of things to insert the marginalized group for years and years, and no one has ever said anything to me about it. Furthermore, if anyone is offended by these statements, that they are just being too sensitive, and they should simply develop a thicker skin. When I suggest that self-esteem is being damaged by these SAEs, I've been told that I was exaggerating. Please know that my message is not just my opinion, but in fact is documented research and research in which I am presently involved. So I want to get us back to the point about the power of words. I want to present a saying that you may have heard back in your elementary school days. And interestingly, people, usually parents, still say it to young children. Let's have that next slide. Sticks and stones may break your bones, but words will never hurt you. Now you're thinking back, again, as I said, to your elementary school days when you said it to someone or someone said it to you. But I think it's an important example of a straight out lie. Yes, I said a straight out lie. Words are more powerful than any stick or stone will ever be. Kids don't really fight anymore physically. Even elementary school students rarely have physical fights. Instead of physically fighting, especially in middle school, young people now use words to say mean things to one another. So the saying gets passed down, and maybe in the following way. Your child or grandchild comes to you crying and says that Bobby or Betty has said something ugly. The adult says, sticks and stones to alleviate the pain. You might reflect back when you first heard sticks and stones, and maybe it was to ease your own hurt feelings by being the target of some ugly put down that referred to your family's race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, body size, or perhaps something about your family's financial situation. The words that were said to you then can still cause internal pain today. The words may still hurt. They still may make you feel excluded in some way. Yes, words are powerful. The pain from physical violence can go away, but the emotional pain caused by words can be everlasting. Next slide. What we know is that there is a clear relationship between physical ailments and emotional and psychological ailments and subtle acts of exclusion. Research shows us that most folks who report that they are under a constant stream of SAEs report severe headaches, frequent migraines, fatigue, exhaustion, high levels of anxiety, feeling depressed, missing days at work, and sometimes there's a combination of all of these. People miss work because they are so tired that they can't get out of bed and that they are anxious. They report, in fact, being tired all the time. Sometimes the exhaustion and fatigue comes from spending cognitive energy trying to figure out why subtle acts of exclusion are being said to and around them. The recipients of subtle acts of exclusion try to make sense of confusing and ambiguous incidents. Time is spent with self-doubting questions such as, did I do something that made X single me out to say that? Was it an innocent statement or question? Was it targeted as a way to unnerve me? Was it because I was one of just a few people of a different religion or race, or maybe because I was a little overweight? What did I do? Why do they torment me? What did I do? And the fact is probably that you did nothing. Nonetheless, you may have spent or continue to spend countless hours ruminating about the incident. That's the way that this type of ambiguity works. There is never any definitive nor satisfying answer, but it is tiring in trying to make it make sense. Next slide. So it is not just the emotional toll that it takes on us, but it's also a physical toll. Research suggests that those folks who report that they are under a constant onslaught of SAEs report higher incidence of diabetes, kidney disease, heart disease, asthma, rashes, hair loss, bald spots, fingernail nubs, and general aches and pains from no obvious source. So let's look very carefully at one very popular SAE. I don't see color. I don't see color. In Martin Luther King's famous speech, the famous I Have a Dream speech on the Lincoln Mall in Washington, D.C. in 1963, he said, I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Now, I didn't realize that this was an ambiguous statement, but a common interpretation by white people is that King was saying that he wanted Black people to blend in and white people should just ignore those differences. The suggestion is that if there was no color, then all the problems of racism would disappear and be eliminated. Now that's one interpretation, but there's also an alternative. King may have been asking white people to embrace the differences and discover the content of the character of the people who are not members of the same race, color, religion, gender, sexuality, or ethnicity. Folks who are different do not want to simply blend in. They do not want to be whitewashed in a pool with other white people so that everyone is the same. They do not want to be excluded, but in fact embraced for the talents that they bring to the table. I don't see color is a subtle act of exclusion. Now, I want you to do some self-reflection now, and this may be tough for some of you, but think of a subtle act of exclusion that you have heard recently, or it can be one that you remember from long ago. I want you to write it down. And this, why I say it may be more tough than something else, because when we actually see it written down, it has more power than when we are still carrying it in our heads. So please write it down, and we'll talk about these at the end of my talk. Now, some of you may be thinking, I have never said an SAE, and I never will. Of course, this is an extreme position. All of us have said something about some group, and often with no intention to harm and out of ignorance and not understanding the hurt that we have inflicted. I am so pleased that the issue of the Washington Redskins can now be talked about in the past tense. The term Redskins is a racial slur. Native Americans have told the owners of the Washington team that it was offensive for years. George Floyd's murder got the attention of the franchise, and in a non-confrontational way, and the team is now called the Washington football team. I have listened carefully to the sports commentators, and I have not heard one single slip to the old name, and I am encouraged. Now, recently, I have been told directly that some white liberals were shocked that Blacks and Native Americans support that the statues should be moved to museums and other locations. They are stunned to hear that in the 21st century, that these subtle acts of exclusions had made Blacks and Native Americans uncomfortable for years. They ask, why weren't these painful concerns brought up years ago? And I want to offer the following example as a response to this question when we think about priorities of pain. My example is that I called my stepbrother Little Cliff for more than 30 years. His name was Clifton, and he was Clifton Jr. Hence the term, family term and whatnot, little. For me, it was his name. He was Little Cliff. That was what he was called. And at about age 40, he told me that he hated the name Little, and please don't call him that name again. I was stunned and asked him why he hadn't told me this years ago. He said that it wasn't the most important thing that he was focusing on as he was growing up, but he really hated being called little, especially as he grew to a 6'1" man. He said that he thought it was obvious that a 40-year-old man would not want to be called Little Cliff. His name was Clifton, and he was fine with Cliff or Clifton, but he asked me not to call him Little Cliff again. He wasn't mad, but I recognized the hurt that I had inadvertently caused him and told him that I wouldn't call him Little Cliff ever again. For him, from his perspective, he thought that I should have figured this out on my own. He said it was obvious. After all, he teased me, wasn't I highly educated? Hadn't I gone to college? Didn't that make sense to you? I was embarrassed, but I understood exactly what he was talking about. Now, I caught myself sometimes wanting to call him Little Cliff, but thinking before I spoke, I always called him Little Cliff from that day forward. I think he appreciated the respect that I was giving him, that he deserved. I hope that this example is helpful as you deal with things that you may have been doing for years and years that you realize now may have caused hurt to others. So subtle acts of exclusion matter. Everybody says something stupid some of the time, but please don't tell me to just develop a thicker skin. Of course, nobody dies from hearing an SAE directed at them, but please know that they are harmful both physically and psychologically to one's health. I want to point out how these sentences are not a knife or a bullet to a vital organ causing death or subjecting the target to physical or mental torture until the point of collapse. For most, generally speaking, the goal of the speaker is not to cause physical or mental breakdown or to destroy someone's self-esteem. The speaker might even say, "I just said one little thing." It is in fact the repetition of these statements or acts that is so damaging. Most recipients are forgiving of ignorance, but SAEs are not funny. Here is an example of an interaction that illustrates how education might not go so well and we may need more discussion groups. In an office setting, the male partner tells the female partner, and notice I didn't say junior partner or secretary, but purposely said partner, that there will be an important meeting at the end of the week. So would she please wear her most flattering blouse and with the low-cut neckline, a fitted skirt, and high heels to the meeting. He adds that he thinks that she looks especially pretty in that kind of outfit. The female partner may have worked at the office for a number of years and has had her work documented as being exemplary in multiple ways. But this is indeed not the first time that her partner has said something like this to her. And for whatever reason, this time she pauses, she thinks carefully and says, "Jack, I want to speak to you about what you're saying. First of all, I believe that you said that to me from your perspective of best intentions. However, I feel uncomfortable about these kinds of statements about how I should dress. I don't think it should matter what I wear. It's my intelligence and my skill that makes for a successful meeting." Now, Jack may think for a minute and respond with, "Of course you are smart, and that's why you're a partner. But I think the other guys in the meeting would like to have a pretty girl in the room with them." The female partner pauses, takes a deep breath, and says, "Jack, I will make my own decisions about what I will wear to work. I believe that I am always professional in dress and in manner, and that's the way I conduct myself." Now Jack seems to be very confused, and he says, "Well, I guess I wasn't being politically correct. I didn't think that you were caught up with all this women's liberation thing. I guess I need to watch what I say around you. In fact, I don't think I'll say anything to you for the next few days or so. And by the way, don't bother coming to the meeting on Friday." Now, what should have been an educational discussion, unfortunately turned into a very uncomfortable situation for both parties, and the female is now wondering if she will continue to have a job. And Jack may be wondering if he should still employ and work with Jill. This fear of retaliation often keeps the recipients of subtle acts of exclusion from expressing their feelings and concerns. So what can we do about subtle acts of exclusion? I urge all of you to be more thoughtful before you speak. Consider being an ally. Allies are very important, but what does it mean to be an ally? In almost everything I read and write, I suggest to folks who want to be an ally to do so. I encourage this, but again, what does it mean to be an ally? Often, allies come to me privately and talk in whispered tones about what they heard was terrible. They tell me how much they support me, and yet in the public arena, they are very quiet. Marginalized groups need more allies, and specifically vocal allies. And by being more vocal, I don't mean confrontational, not necessarily confrontational. So an ally can be someone who says, "ouch," when they hear a subtle act of exclusion. Just ouch, not directed at anyone, just saying ouch. An ally can stare. Sometimes when an SAE is noticed, an ally can simply stare at the speaker. If the speaker says or asks, "Why are you staring at me?" you can then respond to the question with some education as is appropriate. An ally cannot laugh. When an ally hears a so-called joke or some mocking remark, an ally can simply not laugh, but keep a very straight face. Some subtle acts of inclusion speakers look for confirmation from friends and family when they say an SAE. When they hear ouch or have a stare or no laughter follows, it may pointedly but indirectly assert the power of the ally. It is much easier for an ally to speak up when the speaker asks a question such as, "Why did you say ouch? Didn't you think my joke was funny? Why did you stare at me after I said whatever?" When the speaker asks for something, it is more likely that he or she may listen if an ally offers some insight. Perhaps the conversation between Jack and Jill, the partners, did not go so well because Jill didn't give Jack the opportunity to be curious about why she was bringing up the issue of dress at that time. Some people want to be allies, but they feel that they can't speak up because the speaker is old, the speaker is their boss, and an ally doesn't want the speaker to feel uncomfortable. But remember, the target is very uncomfortable. Always know that when you speak up, you are appreciated by the person who was targeted. Now, I'll share with you one of my biggest triumphs. And this was more than 30 years ago. And I was visiting my grandmother, and she used the term Oriental to refer to some Asian people who were on television. My childhood community did not include Asians, and it was probably not until graduate school that I came in contact with members of the Asian community on a personal level. When I heard her use the word Oriental, I said to her gently, "Mom, don't call that person an Oriental. She is Asian." My grandmother didn't get it and made another reference to the Asian lady as Oriental. I didn't want to get into an argument, so I tried again, explaining how that was an old term, in fact, a derogatory term, and to please not use it again. My grandmother did not argue with me, but turned silent. I saw a confused look on her face, but I said nothing more. A few months later, I was with my grandmother again, and a friend of hers used the term Oriental, and I heard my grandmother say, "My granddaughter says that we don't use that word anymore, that we should say Asian." My heart leaped, and I smiled. Sometimes what we say may not show immediate change or consequence, but may show its impact weeks, months, or even years later. I hope that I have built my case and made my point that words matter, and especially subtle actions of exclusion matter. And so I'd like to leave you with a message that may strike you in a helpful way to understand once again the power of words and why it is important to think about how another person may interpret what you say in a markedly different way. Okay. So here it goes. If my spouse comes to me in obvious pain and asks, "Do you love me?" an answer of "I love everyone" would be truthful, but also hurtful and cruel in the moment. If a coworker comes to me upset and says, "My father just died," a response of "Everyone's parents die" would be truthful, but also hurtful and cruel in the moment. So when a friend speaks up in obvious pain and hurt and says, "Black lives matter," and I respond, "Everyone's life matters," it is truthful, but it is hurtful and cruel in the moment. Next slide. So when I'm asked, do subtle acts of exclusion, microaggressions, matter? My response is, SAEs matter to the mental health and physical health of the recipient to whom the statements are directed. They impact the self-esteem, emotionality, and all things perceived through the senses. They may be there may be a negative impact experienced by the speaker as well. Knowing this, when the recipients or targets are told, you are too sensitive, stupid people say stupid things all the time, it's not about you, get over it, it may be truthful, but it is hurtful and cruel in the moment. Thank you. Next slide. Thank you. Thank you for your attention. Questions?
So here's one from, I'm originally from, is that Mississippi? Have been told often I don't sound like I'm from that place. Why not? Is that Mississippi? What is MS? Mississippi or
Mississippi?
Mississippi, right?
Okay, so what is the question again? Let me see if I can get at it.
There is a person is from Mississippi and he's been told that he doesn't sound like he's from there. And what does that mean?
Yeah. So when we think about that, sometimes, unfortunately, the thinking is that, well, Southerners in general, and this is what Northerners think, well, because they're speaking slowly or speaking with an accent, that they can't be very smart. Because if they were smart, they would speak quickly and rapidly like they do in the North, and that's a clear sign of intelligence. So it is in fact a subtle put down by saying that you don't sound like someone from Mississippi, saying that that can't be part of my intelligence circle because Southerners or Mississippians can't be very smart. That's insulting. It is hurtful, especially when you are saying, but this is who I am, respect me for who I am. But when people have these stereotypes, it is difficult for them to understand that these stereotypes are not true. It takes kind of a couple examples to make a stereotype, but thousands of examples to kind of break that down. So you will hear sometimes people say things such as, can a woman really be vice president? After all, isn't that a man's job? And what we take is that because there's always been men, that surely this must be a man's job. And notice how disrespectful this is. But it is part of the stereotype that we've developed, and we think, well, that must be the way it is because we don't see any evidence to the contrary. Now, of course, we have mothers that run households, women that run the businesses and the world, and many will say, as Beyonce does, women run the world. But when we think about our interpretation of these stereotypes, we have to think about it, especially since the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, what a powerful woman that was. The second to be elected to the, I guess it's not elected, appointed to the Supreme Court, but what a brilliant woman, what a brilliant perspective she brings. But before then, Supreme Court justices, except for Sandra Day O'Connell, were men. And there was the thought that a woman could not handle the job. Disrespectful to say those kinds of things, but understand what kind of hurt that means when we have to deal with it.
Great, thank you. Carolyn, my chat is gone. I don't have a chat.
I'm good. I'm good. So
Okay.
we have two people who have asked to unmute themselves. We had a couple questions before that. So if you are the target of subtle acts of aggression, how do you recover your self-esteem?
That's such a good question, because oftentimes I'll respond with self-assurance that you are not crazy. Because sometimes people think, well, you know, maybe I've done something that's brought this on, or maybe I'm not being realistic about what's happening to me. No, number one, that you are not crazy. And I would suggest that you get with either other women or men or people within your group to talk about these kinds of things. Also, I'm a very big supporter of therapy, and that if you can have group therapy or individual therapy to talk about these kinds of issues, it can be very helpful. Again, sometimes we think we're the only one who's hearing these kinds of things. And again, you know, having problems with our self-esteem because we think we're the only one. You can find support with others, that you are not alone and that you are strong in who you are.
Thank you.
I've got it, Carolyn. I found it.
Got it.
So my husband adjusted how he spoke to kids on a basketball team he coaches. Rather than girls, he says kids, because all children in the group may not identify as female. Is that acceptable?
In fact, yes. If we are trying to find those terms that are neutral. In the old days, I used to always tease because Southerners and Northerners as well will say something like y'all. And although it may not sound as sophisticated, I kind of like that term because it has no gender. Now, a lot of times you've heard that you guys, so they adopted that, but I always thought that that was a bit sexist, but they were to tell me that guys just meant everybody. Well, yes, no, maybe not. But if we can find those more general terms, those are the ones that we use. Now, here's something for you English teachers. I had a very strict English teacher in 7th and 8th grade who was very conscious of telling me how plural pronouns should be used and singular pronouns had to have the specific reference. Well, some of that is changing now because as people are identifying as they, the individual is identifying as they, the reference is not as strict as it once was. So it might be the case that John said such and so, and they think this way. It's still referring to the same person, but that person is recognizing the plurality of their of themselves, and it is a new world of how we're addressing people and their individual feelings.
I think the next up, Enid, is Marie Baker, and Marie, you're unmuted.
Hey, I think I am.
Yes.
Bev, I'm sure you've experienced, and I have, that people sometimes will say to you, but you're special, you're different. Correct?
Yes, yes. And again, that's a great example of a subtle act of exclusion. Now, I think that sometimes the idea is that I want to include you in because you're special and you're different. But in fact, it's making you feel even more excluded because what am I doing that's any different from everyone else? I want to be in with the crowd, not singled out. And that's what that's doing. It is not really complementing the target as it was intended. And I think that, again, this is how we're coming into our new world of understanding this. I think the expression was given to be a compliment, but in fact, I'm always a little unnerved. As you said, over the years, I'm unnerved by that because that's singling me out to say that somehow I'm different. And in fact, I'm not. And it continues on. We sometimes perpetuate that in our schools by having students who we think are singled out that way. And that, again, makes them feel uncomfortable as thinking, what is making them so different? So that's a tough one.
Enid just dropped back in, and let's see, what are more examples of SAEs from white people?
Just in general? Let me think of some others.
Okay.
Well, let's see if I can come up with some of what you were saying as far as these microaggressions.
Can I give you one example?
Yes, please.
When a white person is speaking to a black person and they say, she's so articulate.
And that's one that probably I
Is that
get
one?
most upset about. because when I remember I was looking at something on television on the news, and I went away from the room, and they talked about how articulate the person was, and I said, they're talking about a Black person. And sure enough, they were. And for whatever reason, it seems to be that white people don't think that we are as articulate as everyone else, and they underscore it by singling that particular characteristic out. Once I had a student, because I taught this class microaggressions at UVA, and the student said that they heard the microaggression from another student who was saying that they just had a class from a history professor, and he was excellent, and they were so surprised. And the student was saying, why are you surprised? And they said, we didn't think that Black people could teach history like this person did. So I thought, okay, not sure quite how to take that, but somehow the notion that if that Black person was going to be their teacher, they would be less qualified than everyone else. What they find usually the case is the Black person is quite articulate in the sense that they are well prepared and give some of the best lectures that I've heard at UVA. I think that's the case at most places. Let me try to find you.
Are there any more
examples?
Oh, Laura Geisler has sent us a website with some examples of microaggressions. Thank you, Laura.
That's great. Let me see if I can give you some too. Oh, wrong one.
Okay, I don't see any more. Let me see. I have been having, oh my goodness, it happened again. I don't believe it.
I don't know why I'm not finding it.
Well, would it be okay to give some more questions and comments, and maybe as they come forward?
Yeah, can you do that, please, Carolyn?
Absolutely, sure.
It's gone again. I'm having a lot of trouble here.
Sorry.
It's okay.
Professor Horniman at the Darden School developed a language of exclusion. For example, eliminate but as it discourages diverse thoughts. Use and as it is inclusive and adds positive energy and endorses what was said before. Language of inclusion, excuse me, not language of exclusion. Sorry, I read. Thanks for the excellent presentation. Can you tell us how the reaction of your research has evolved over time, if it has?
That's a very good point. When I first started out, and we're talking maybe 15, 20 years ago, when I first started gathering these microaggressions, these subtle acts of exclusion, what I would do would be to ask people, as I asked you today, just tell me some things that you've heard in your community within the last week. So I was teaching a class weekly, and the first week, students would say things like, oh no, no one here at UVA uses microaggressions or subtle acts of exclusion. These students are much too educated and much too kind of sophisticated to say these kinds of things. And my task each week was for them to come back with just one microaggression or subtle acts of exclusion that they heard during the week. And every week, everybody had an example. And they were different examples. And they were subtle acts of exclusion for gender, race, ethnicity. One of the ones that I get a kick out of is that there is, I asked the class, and some of you may have some opinion about this, is holding the door by a male for a female a subtle act of exclusion? Is it a microaggression? And it was interesting that my class was split on this, that one of the guys said, my mother would kill me if I didn't hold the door for a woman. Whether it was an older woman or a young woman, that was how I was brought up. And if my mother ever found out that I didn't hold the door, that she would just be on me. And in contrast, one of the young ladies said, I am fine. I can open a door myself. I do not need a man to open the door for me. So we talked a lot about that it was not necessarily the case that the fellows thought that the women couldn't, that some of it was just custom and tradition, but there still is that bit of a tension. Now, what I noticed myself is that younger guys and older guys too tend to hold the door open for me, but I make a point of holding the door open for males as well, or anybody who follows me into an office. And people are sometimes surprised at that, but I think, well, that's only fair. If the person who comes through the door first is a male or a female, for me, the expectation is that you would hold the door. But sometimes people are very confused about what that means as far as femininity and masculinity. And again, I want to underscore that we're in changing times. If we had asked this question maybe 20 years ago, there would have been probably a 90% assumption that that is not a microaggression. There's nothing that that is gender related to that. But now we're thinking, well, for some, maybe it is.
Another, oh, did you want to go, Enid?
Sure, especially
Okay.
that's my daughter. Tata. Okay, so she's saying, I work with predominantly white colleagues, and at any social gathering, I'm asked to show everyone how to dance or to show them the new dance without fail.
That is a big, subtle act of exclusion. Again, these stereotypes and assumptions that somehow your race or your gender should give you special talents. Now, interestingly enough, I talked to Asian students who feel that they have been experiencing a lot of microaggressions under that same kind of category, that they're asked by their classmates, help me with my math.
Yeah.
Help me with my science, help me with my chemistry project. And they want to say, well, that's not my strong suit. I'm really stronger in English, but then they're kind of put down for that because, quote unquote, shouldn't that Asian student be an expert in math? Another kind of
yeah.
little act, yeah.
What else do we have?
You look good for your age.
Oh, yeah.
That's one spot. Somebody said that. I mean, you know. Okay, moving along.
But that's a popular one. That's
yeah.
a popular one. And, you know, it's kind of the thing that you want to say, thank you, but move along. But oftentimes people will say, well, what do you do? And you think, well, I live right, you know, and I live like I should. But the other one that I was thinking about with age is that sometimes people will assume that you need help in crossing the street or anything you do because you're a certain age.
You're less. Mm-hmm.
And again, this subtle act of exclusion just makes that assumption. And sometimes they will talk to the more advanced age person as, boy, you know, he or she is awfully feisty. They won't let me do anything for them. But you think, well, that's not to be just assumed that I need help. I can ask for help if I need it. And sometimes I can, you know, need the help, but please ask before you just assume that I need to be helped.
Right. Now we have a burning question from Laura Geisler to everyone, and I cannot find it on my screen. It came in at 6:20.
Okay.
If you can find it.
Yes, I've heard that asking someone about their country of origin is often felt as an SAE. Is it possible to express genuine interest in someone's family and life experience and ethnic background without causing them to feel excluded, or is it really better not to ask?
That's a great one. And I hear that especially at the beginning of the new year from students. And here's the difference. Someone might say, you know, where are you from? And depending on who you are, you might say, I'm from Cincinnati, I'm from Ohio. Now, if you have kind of the features of the Asian, they won't seem to let it go. They will then say, but where are you really from? And a student or you know, an adult has said, well, I'm from, you know, before that, my family lived in Northern Virginia. And then the question is, but where are you really from? And I've heard the examples of, well, my great-great-grandmother was from Korea. And they say, that's it, I knew it. And you think, that's what you call intrusive, because you're not really trying to be curious about the family background. You're really trying to say, you are not from here. Tell me where you're from, because you don't look like what we call Americans. Tell me where you're really from. Right. So that gets to that category of excluding. So right. When you're talking about where you're from and you get an answer, it is important that you accept that answer, because that's what they've given you. They have not given you then the right to ask question after question after question until you feel that you have been satisfied.
Okay, that's great. So from Frank Dukes, are there subtle acts of inclusion that we can cultivate?
Cultivate positively, or?
I'm pretty sure he means positively. It doesn't say, but I'm assuming. Frank, unmute yourself and tell me if I'm wrong.
Subtle acts of inclusion, right?
Subtle acts of inclusion that we can cultivate.
Part of that I was getting at with the example with, the disastrous example with the two partners and the male colleague saying, dress a certain way. So we want to have situations where we let people know that these are safe places to talk about these kinds of things. So I think exposure to friends and colleagues in non-threatening ways can be ways to cultivate these positive stereotypes. So it's the case that some people are very good at math or English or whatnot, and to recognize that it's not something that's genetic, it's not something that is especially goes with that ethnicity, but in fact to bring people into understanding what those cultures are like. And as I said in the talk, to embrace them, to understand that I want to have that person or that group as part of my circle of people I know, because I really respect what they bring to the table. Rather than they are so odd and different, I don't want them to be part of my group. Let's see if we can open that circle wider to include more and appreciate those differences. So there are a number of minor little things that really sometimes grate at people's character, because they think, why are they picking on this again? If, as I said before, if we let people know that this is not acceptable. Again, the example of the Redskins. People thought it was okay to call that Washington team Redskins after repeatedly Native Americans had said, that's a racial slur. We would have never said that it was okay to call them the Washington N-word or the Washington B-word, because it was some words that we had said for years and years. But because that group wasn't part of our group, we thought it was okay to call them by that derogatory term. So again, it is important to embrace these differences. And when we find out that they are in fact probably not as different as we think, we can cultivate them more.
There was one from before that I'd like to share. Well, looking back on some things I have said, meaning to be complimentary, but I realized later it was not. In fact, it was a microaggression. Now I want to apologize, but that seems just like adding insult to injury.
Well, it depends. If this is a friend, you may want to go back to that person and say, I didn't realize how ignorant I was. I can give you the example that I've used in many talks, but I think it's always a good one. I had a friend who was from the Netherlands, and he and I would get together at conferences. And at one of the conferences, I said, well, let's have lunch together. And he said, fine, but after this one talk, we'll get together at noon and we'll meet at whatever restaurant. And I said, fine. And I added, let's go Dutch. Well, he took me aside and he said, why did you say that? The Dutch people are not stingy. The Dutch people are generous. Why do Americans keep saying that to me? And at first I was thinking, what is he talking about? I'm just saying, let's go Dutch. That means you pay for yours, I pay for mine. And then it hit me that somehow he was interpreting that, and others had said that to him. And his interpretation was that Dutch people must be stingy because of that kind of expression. I was mortified because, of course, this was a friend. I wasn't insulting him or planned to insult him in any way, but this is how it came out. I spent, the next few minutes apologizing, saying, I had no idea. I didn't realize exactly what I was saying. Thank you for telling me. I'll never use that again. And since that time, even with Americans, I don't use that term because I didn't realize that I was insulting Dutch people. And even if it's not insulting all Dutch people, he felt it was insulting. And I decided that I wouldn't say it again. And I let him know. Another example that I've used over the years is that with, the term called Indian givers. So I was doing something with someone and I had offered them something. I don't know if it was a pencil or a pen, and then they took it and then I wanted it back. And I said something like, oh, that's just me being an Indian giver. And I hadn't realized what I said until I listened to myself and I thought, I have just insulted all of Native Americans. What is wrong with me? And I studied this, but I still made that kind of faux pas, not understanding what I was saying until I thought about it. So again, that's something else I will never say again, because it was something that I hadn't given much thought to, but when I listened to what I was saying, I was really sorry that I had ever said that. But as a kid, we said things like this without much thought of what damage it might be doing to an ethnicity, a race, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it may be fine to go back to that person and say, please understand, I didn't get it before, but I want to understand now.
That's great. That's a wonderful response. Let me see. Okay. From Joyce Lewis, what are you when inquiring about one's ethnicity? You may have covered this a little bit, but maybe a more expanded response.
And it can happen with any ethnicity, with any race. It can often have to happen with gender identity. So with people, again, not thinking about how the other person might respond, say things like this. What are you? What do they expect people to say is always my question, is that what will be satisfying to them? Do they think that you're supposed to say, well, I'm African American? Are they supposed to say, well, I'm really white, but I just look like a Black person? I mean, it's just very strange as to what you think someone is supposed to say about that. But it is that level of curiosity that somehow we think that we have permission to ask. I'll give you one example that is still a strange one for me. In current times, people will say things like, can I touch your hair? And I still think that that is very odd. And in fact, it's disrespectful. So if any of you think that you want to ask that to your friends, don't. That is not something that you ask. But I was never asked that, like in the 60s and the 70s. No white person ever, and I had a big afro in those days. I was the kind of Angela Davis afro in those days. But no white person ever said, could I touch your hair? So now, a generation later, people are asking them. And I think if you are African American and you're asked that, I think it is fine to say no. No, that is an invasion of who I am or my person. And I don't think that I will allow you to invade my space. But just be mindful that that is not a compliment and is one that people with natural hair as I have do not appreciate. So again, rather than to get yourself into a situation of, well, my feelings were hurt because Beverly didn't allow me to touch her hair, is something you don't want to deal with. You don't have to deal with that at all. That is their space, their boundary space.
Okay. My mom uses a walker, and she and I are annoyed with people, especially doctors, not looking at her, but at me when talking about her health and asking me questions and ignoring her. That's prevalent.
Especially with this age group. You know, this is a senior center. And I find that a lot. The first time that I read that microaggression in a textbook, I thought, this can't be true. This just can't be true until I observed it firsthand. And being with somebody, an older person, in this case, it was my grandmother and then my mother, and they were lucid. They were not hard of hearing at the time. They were not incapable of responding to the question. But in fact, the professional looked to me and began asking me questions. What I often did was then to redirect them to my mother or grandmother who knew their condition much better than I did. But that's one of those kind of disrespectful comments that are made to people of a certain age or a certain look or et cetera. I know that I teased a lot once is that when I'm at the university and I'm introduced as, say, so-and-so and Dr. Adams, depending on the man that I'm with, he will be the one that gets the attention, not me. So I was a member, still am a member of the Colonnade Club, the faculty club at UVA. And I am the member. I am the lifetime member. Yet when I am with someone else, when I'm with a male, it is he who gets the questions addressed to. And I have to say, no, I am the member. And sometimes they're embarrassed and sometimes they're not. They just turn to me and say, well, okay. But again, there is still that stigma of this inequality with males and females, with blacks and whites, that sometimes we're not given the respect of our position or our age. And we have to deal with this. And remember, one of the points that I think is really important in a non-confrontational way. Generally speaking, being confrontational does not get us as far as we want. Think about how non-confrontational ways have gotten so much accomplished in this time, the year of George Floyd, that many of the things that have happened that we would have not expected to have happened have taken place during this special year. So it is good.
Okay, I think we have time for, let's see, here's a good one. Tom Cross has a couple of things, but I like this one. Don't we need a balance between being hypersensitive to every word and taking a positive intent from our interactions?
Well, Tom, when we think about what it means to be hypersensitive, I'm not exactly sure what that means. And I was trying to make that point within my talk, is that words are ambiguous. And depending upon who we are, we decide, if we're hypersensitive to that or not. I may not be sensitive to, I'm trying to think of the word, what is it, kafir, which is the N word in Africa. So I can say kafir because it doesn't hit me directly, but I'm not going to say the N word because that, I believe, is disrespectful to me. So sometimes when we think about hypersensitive, it does not mean the same thing to everyone. I think we should be sensitive, that we should be reflective of the kinds of things that we say and what other people may interpret that as. But it's a little tricky when you talk about hypersensitive. I think we should respect and reflect when we speak or when we're getting ready to speak. I am always on that positive end. So, and that's the case, I think, with most people. Most of the time when we hear a subtle act of exclusion, we want to give the benefit of the doubt. We want to think that that person did not say that with the intent to be disrespectful. That person did not make that joke to make me feel uncomfortable. But we have to understand that depending on who we are, those things are not funny. Those things can be disrespectful. And we really have to take that perspective when we're thinking about saying them and when we're receiving them. So again, everything that someone says is not a subtle act of exclusion. Every time someone says something, it is not a subtle act of exclusion, but the repetition is something that we really take note with. And if you are told that this is something that bothers me, this is something that I find uncomfortable, and if the person continues to make that remark, then we can move that into that person is being insensitive and that person does not care about my feelings or my self-esteem.
Well, Dr. Adams, you have given us an outstanding presentation. I appreciate it so much. But we want to thank you very, very much for participating in this speaker series.
Thank you so much, Enid, for asking me. And thank you, all of you who have stayed to the end. I understand that lots goes on now that I'm a retired person, and you would think that there would be lots of time to do lots of things. But in fact, it seems like time has shrunk somewhat. But I appreciate that everybody came, and maybe we'll think about some of the things that I say, and maybe you don't agree with everything that I say. That is fine. That is fine. But at least to be thoughtful and reflective, I think, are my aims.
That's awesome. Thank you. So everyone, please take a moment to answer the poll questions.
And while we're doing that, I just want to pass a couple on to say, I'm sorry, we didn't get to everybody's questions and comments, but people really thought it was important about I don't see color very much. Thank you for really bringing that forward and talking to us about it in other terms, honey and dear, and they thought the ouch was very good to be used for things like that. Let's see. Lots of thank yous.
Yep, a lot of thank yous.
I always think that out of the series, mine is probably more controversial than all the other talks, but that's okay. This is a group that is willing to deal with controversy, and I like that.
Yep, we do too. Love this group. And I'd like to remind everyone that next Wednesday, September 30th at 5:30, we have Alex Hernandez, who will present Viva la Causa, Building a Movement. So I hope you're all going to sign on to our Zoom at 5:30 next Wednesday. This has been just a wonderful response to our presentations.